Hi, thank you so much for tuning back in to this week's reading of Max Lucado's book, The Story. However, if you tuned in last week, you understand that we are reading the book of Esther. We are learning all about the Queen of Beauty and the Queen of Courage. And what an incredible story it was. So if you did not follow along, that is chapter 20 with Queen Esther. And this week, though, we're going to do two parts. And I let you know that last week that I'm going to read today from all the women of the Bible. And I'm going to read about Esther. And in here it's called Esther and the Balance of Power. So I'd love to hear what you're saying, because you know what? In some of the comments you'll see, people who are participating in this Bible study, how they are relating to Queen Esther as a wife and as a mother and in this world, and how do we approach our husbands, and what is the response from that. I'm incredibly intrigued by that with her, and so I thank you for tuning in. It is a beautiful, beautiful hot summer day here in Alberta. My name is Lesley Donaldson, and this is a weekly Bible study. However, in the last couple weeks, we have had a corporate client that has taken us outside of our office and so forth. So it has been incredibly busy, and we are now going to move out of the hotel industry. And we are going to be living full-time in our RV, and we are so excited. So all that right now is taking place, and so forgive me if it's been a bit late in our readings, but let's just keep going. So today I would like to, I am going to read chapter 21 from the story. But today, part A is going to be Esther and the power and the balance of power. And this is found in all the women of the Bible. It's a great, great book. So let's just pick right up. Let's just start reading. So it starts with this. I hate politics, really. And I've had nothing but politics since poor Queen Vashti, silly woman, got above herself. She actually refused the king's summons to attend him at a royal banquet. You just don't do that to Xerxes, king of the Medes and the Persians. Axerxes, we call him. He is king, after all. I mean, it's just not right to refuse him. However annoyed you might be at having your own banquet interrupted, or however much you might hate being shown off before a drunken group of psychopathic royal administrators, talk about pearls before swine. Now, let's just stop right there, because isn't that a different tone than what we have been reading in the story? So it is a totally different take on Queen Esther, and that's why I wanted to read it to you. A different way of reading it from truly her perspective of who Queen Esther was and how she sees things. So let's keep reading. I find the way they wrote this book very, very interesting to read. But refuse she did, and that was the end of her. No, of course he didn't kill her. It might have been kinder, though. He had her banished from his presence forever by edict, and his court cheered. They were terrified that their wives might take a leaf out of Vashti's book and start disobeying them. I wasn't at court then. I was living with Uncle Mordecai, who took me in when my parents died and raised me as his own daughter. I was called Hadassah, Hadassah. Then, our whole family is Jewish. You see, we were deported from Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and landed here in Susa. Well, eventually, the king calmed down about Vashti and began to feel lonesome. So his courtiers suggested he replace her. And I won the contest. Really. They brought in pretty girls from all over the country, and I was one. I went by Esther. Didn't tell anyone I was Jewish. Uncle had warned me not to. Anyway, they put us in the harem and gave us a year's worth of beauty treatments and lessons in court etiquette. Haggai, the king's eunuch, he was custodian of the harem. Thought I was wonderful, I guess. He gave me 7 maids and moved us to the best part of the harem. I was really surprised. And then, at the end of the year, they dressed us up and sent us one by one into the king to see who would please him and replace Queen Vashti. When it came to my turn, I just went in wearing what Haggai gave me. No extra jewelry or anything, and, well, that seemed to be enough. I was named the favorite. That banquet was fantastic. It was shortly after the banquet that I had my first conscious experience of politics. Really scary. It happened when Uncle, who worked at the Chancellery, discovered that Bigthan and Teresh, the king's own eunuchs, had planned to assassinate him. Uncle told me, I told the king, and the conspirators were hanged. The whole incident was written up in the Book of Chronicles in the king's presence, but Uncle got no reward. Then, the very same week, the king raised Haman to be chief officer of the state and ordered that all chancellery people were to bow and prostrate themselves before him. When I heard it, I was livid. The king owed Uncle Mordecai and me his life. Why hadn't he rewarded Uncle with this power and honor? I gave Uncle an earful, and the next time I saw him privately, he taught me my first political lesson. Politics, he says, is the art by which a ruler stays in power. Now, the first thing a king learns is that all his subordinates, all of them, want his power, or, failing that, as much power over him as they can get. Every one of them is always watching all the rest to make sure that no one has more power over the king than he does. To stay alive and in power, then, the king has to keep all the power he delegates in balance. To do that, he has to make sure that all his followers have equal or equivalent power over him, and that power is more apparent than real. All the real power he keeps for himself. Clear so far? Yes, but I said, and he hushed me. We have no time, my dove. Just listen. Now, when someone saves the king's life, his power over the king looks to everyone else all but absolute. The king is the first man in the kingdom, and he owes us. And what's the king's life worth? Anything we'd care to name. I couldn't keep still. So what does he think he's doing, raising that Haman to the second man in the kingdom, if he owes us his life? That makes no sense. What he's doing, my pet, is saving my life, Uncle said. And it was clear he wasn't joking. If he had given me that honor, it would have thrown delegated power in the kingdom completely out of balance. Consequently, I would draw all the envy of the whole court. I wouldn't live out the month. But by naming Haman and making the whole chancellery bow and prostrate before him, the king has balanced and the delegated power again by setting up another apparent power base equal to the one we earned by saving his life. And since that saves my life, he doesn't owe us any more. He's paid the debt in kind. He's a very wise man, our king, and clever as a basket of snakes. Don't ever cross him or underestimate him. Uncle left then, and I thought about what he'd said. It made sense. It also explained why Vashti's refusal was so terrible, and why he had to replace her and left alive. She was challenging him for his royal power, upsetting the crucial balance of power completely. If she were not punished, the king could lose the kingdom, but she could not be killed, for with Vashti dead, the incident was over. But with her alive, her offense and its consequences were an active reminder to everyone of who was king and what that meant. As Uncle said, clever as a basket of snakes and a dangerous man to cross. Takes one to know one, I thought. But a couple of days later, I really began to wonder. My wise and prudent uncle, I learned through the harem grapevine, was defying Haman and scorning his power and the king's orders by refusing to bow and prostrate himself before that slug. Now that was unbalancing the power of the kingdom spectacularly. How? Oh, I understood why, all right. I knew that we Jews only bow and prostrate ourselves before the Lord God, and he is the only God there is or can be. And that's just that. Uncle couldn't bow, and so he told the chancellor's officials when they asked. But still, what he was doing was more than dangerous. It was suicidal. In fact, it proved worse than that. When the chancellery officials reported Uncle's refusal to Haman, he saw for himself that Uncle would not do him homage. So he asked Uncle's race. When he learned Uncle was a Jew, he declared war on us all. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that? And that being a certain race, your whole race has been declared war on. Unbelievable. And you don't dare say it, but it happened. Not openly, of course. He just reported to the king that there was this one race of people who consistently defied all the king's edicts and to the detriment of the kingdom and the king's interests, and that if the king would decree their destruction, he, Haman, would put 10,000 talents of silver in the royal treasury. That is a lot of money. Haman was being a barrel full of snakes at that point. He played on the king's fear of revolt, of usurpation, and the destabilization of the kingdom, and on his greed, and the fact that the treasury always needed more money, and it worked. Keep the money, the king, giving Haman his signet ring, and take the people. Do as you please with them. That's when Uncle came to me. Not directly, of course. That wasn't possible. The edict Haman had sent out under the king's name had put a death sentence on Uncle and every one of us Jews. We were to be slaughtered, men, women, and children, on the 14th day of the 12th month. And there was no appeal, not to the king or the government, that is. For us, however, there was the Lord God. Weeping and tearing his garments, Uncle put on sackcloth and ashes, came to the gate of the chancellery, and stayed there wailing loudly and bitterly. It took them 3 minutes for news of that to get to me. I set out some clothes for Uncle to put on instead of the sackcloth. He refused. So I sent Hatak, the eunuch the king had appointed to wait on me, and told him to find out what was going on. When he came back, he had the whole story, a copy of the edict of extermination that had been published in Susa, and a note from Uncle reminding me of what I owed him for bringing me up. Talk about politics. And telling me to pray to the Lord God and then go to the king and plead for our people. Well, I sent message back explaining that I couldn't just barge into the king's inner court at any time I wanted, that I had to wait to be summoned, and anyone who did go without a summons would be killed instantly unless the king extended his scepter to him. That was the law. Still is, for that matter. Uncle's answer was classic. The balance of power again, only this time the Lord God was at the heart of the equation. Don't think for a minute, he said, that you're going to be the one Jew to escape. Just because you live in the harem of the royal palace, I promise you, you're not. If you keep your mouth shut and think you can hide your race behind a Greek name, you'll perish and your father's house will vanish with you. And the Lord God will deliver us through someone else's help. Then for good measure, he added, who can tell? Who can tell? Maybe this was the Lord God's reason for having you come so close to the throne in the first place. What could I do? There I was, caught in the balance point of the powers of the earth and heaven, standing between the king and my people, the Lord God's people, to speak his word and maybe save us all, or to be silent and certainly die. No contest, but I was terrified, I can tell you. I sent word to Mordecai to start a strict fast with all the Jews in Susa. Nothing to eat or drink, day or night, for 3 days. I promised my maids, and I would keep that same fast. And then I would go to the king if I had to die for it. And that's what we did. I put on sackcloth, put ashes and dung in my hair, and spent the 3 days and nights in prayer to the Lord God for his people. I reminded him that he was my only helper, and told him that though his punishment of exile was all we deserved for sinning against him, these enemies were planning to wipe us out entirely. I begged him to save us, to save his power on earth. And then I asked him for courage and to transform the fires of the king's enmity towards his people, lit and fanned by Haman, into love and favor for us. There was more, I guess, but I can't remember it right now. After the fast, I bathed, had my hair washed and dressed, put on my very best clothes, and every single one of my jewels, all gifts of the king. 2 of my maids walked with me. I couldn't have moved without them. I was so weak. I still didn't know what I was going to say, but as I didn't know whether I'd be alive to say anything once I put a foot inside the door of the inner court, that didn't seem a problem. At the door, I took a very deep breath. I stepped over the threshold, raised my eyes to the king's face, startled, enraged, something. I didn't stop to study it. I sank right down in a court obedience as the room spun. I leaned on my maid and held my breath. The next several seconds lasted a century or so. Then I felt his arms around me and heard him asking frantically, "What's the matter, Esther?" He held me tight, assuring me that I would not die, that the order was meant only for ordinary people. "Come to me," he finished, and laid the golden scepter on my neck. I was overwhelmed, so grateful. I babbled something about his looking like an angel and being frightened on that account, and then to my shame, I fainted completely. What a champion the Lord God chose in me. He saves my life and I pass out. When they finally revived me, the king kept telling me I should ask for whatever I wanted, and he would grant it. I guessed I should bring up Haman and the Jews, but when I opened my mouth, I was surprised as anyone in the room to hear myself inviting him and Haman to come to a banquet that very day. He laughed in relief, said of course they would come, and sent for Haman to tell him. And I went back to the harem wondering how on earth would we get a royal banquet ready in 4 hours. Bless Haggai. He set every slave in the palace to work on that meal, and it was splendid. Haman arrived with the king. They feasted with pleasure, and the king asked me again what I wanted, that even if it were half his kingdom, it was mine. Now that scared me. I was remembering that the balance of power in Vashti's fate, you see, and glancing at Haman's face, I realized that I already had too much power to keep. Somehow things had to shift back, but Uncle had never taught me how to do that. Lord God, help me now, I prayed, and opened my mouth. What came out was an invitation to both of them to another banquet the following day, and a promise that then I would make my request. They were delighted. Haman especially. He had never been so honored. Well, let me tell you, I was shocked. What was the point of a second banquet? Then it occurred to me that the Lord God must have sent the words. I never would have said them on my own. So I got Haggai started on the next banquet. Has that ever happened to you, that you go to say something in a situation and it's as if God has used your vocal cords to say something completely different, and when you think about it, you think, where did that come from? I never would have said that. That must have been God. I've had that happen to me before. It's incredible, and it's happening to Queen Vashti or Queen Esther. Later on, of course, I learned what the Lord God was doing between that day and the next. Unable to sleep that night, the king had the book of Chronicles read to him. He heard the passage describing Mordecai saving his life from that would-be assassins, Bigthan and Teresh, and in asking, he learned that Mordecai had never been rewarded. He decided that would never do. And as Haman had just arrived on his own business, he, to get the king's permission to execute Uncle for contempt, using the 50-cubit gallows he had built. The king asked his advice about a reward for someone unnamed. Assuming that someone was himself, Haman went all out. The king's clothes, his horse, a datum, a street parade with proclamation by a high noble, and that was just to be this person's reward. Hurry then, the king said, and do all that for Mordecai, the Jew who works at the chancellery. On no account leave anything out that you have mentioned. Oh, shocked to the core, Haman opened his mouth, but unfortunately for him, could say nothing. Instead, he smiled and set off, no doubt grinding his teeth once he was well aware from that palace. He knew he had to carry out for his enemy to the letter the reward he had designed for himself. That's how the Lord God restores the true balance of power. And that was the only beginning. Haman finished up, went home, and told his wife, Zerah, and the others what had happened. They were the ones who had advised him to build the gallows and execute Mordecai in the first place. But they gave him no comfort. Indeed, they reminded him that if Mordecai, who had just risen above him so dramatically, happened to be a Jew, Haman would never be able to surpass him. And at that point, the servants from the palace arrived to bring him to my banquet. I knew nothing of Haman's forced honoring of Mordecai that day, of course, and it was a good thing. I was frightened enough, and it was of the man's hatred and envy and that decree hanging over us. The banquet passed for me in a blur, and we got to the last of the wine, and in what seemed like 10 breaths, though I know it was only 3 hours or more. Once again, the king asked me what I wanted from him and promised he would give me anything I asked. This time, when I took my deep breath and opened my mouth, the words that came out were no shock to me, for they were the truth of my heart and my being. I asked him to grant me my life and the lives of my people, for we had all been condemned to die. I told him I wouldn't have asked if we were simply to be enslaved, but since we were to be killed, the one man who persecuted us could not simply repair the damage that would be done to the kingdom, nor undo the king's own loss. Don't look at me. That whole speech was the Lord God's doing, first to last. Remember, the king had to keep power in his realm in balance, but the Lord God holds the hearts of kings in his hands and can arrange matters as he wishes for his chosen ones. Who's the man? The king demanded, breaking in. And who would dare to do such thing? Where is he? He was white with rage and angrier than I've ever seen him, angrier than I ever hope to see him again. That was the Lord's wrath, I believe, burning through the king. Who is he? Who is he? I repeated. The one who hates us and has commanded us to die? Why, it's Haman sitting right there. Can you imagine? Well, Haman started to quake. The king flung himself from his couch and plunged out into the garden in his fury. And Haman, knowing his life was forfeit, threw himself across me, blubbering and begging for his life. I never got a chance to answer him. The king stormed back into the banquet hall, saw Haman prostrate across my couch, pinning me in, and froze, his mouth dropping open. Then, very softly, in a tone so deadly it made the hair on my neck stand up, he said, "And now he's going to rape my queen, and in my palace before my very eyes." Can you imagine? He thinks that. And that was the end of Haman. They hanged him on the gibbet